So, wanted to talk about geodesign pretty much at a conceptual level today, and a little bit of technology towards the end, and give you some background on why I got interested in the topic and why I've just recently jumped in with both feet and started a company with Geodesign in the name. So basically I want to talk about what and why first, and then kind of how, some options on how to bring it forward, and have a little bit of a conversation, a brainstorm about which ideas, which implementation strategies, which applications make the most sense. Kind of the idea of heading towards a hacker's geodesign agenda, essentially. It's a fancified term for it, but basically that's it. I mean, what's the community want to move towards? So some background on me. Basically, I've worked in environmental planning and landscape architecture for about 20 years. Started out at Harvard GSD, where my advisor was Carl Steinitz, and so a lot of the ideas that I got conceptually were from Carl and his framework for geodesign, which is now a book. But I was his implementation guy, basically, for 15 years, which was one hell of a hard job, but it was also a really interesting one. To give you some idea, I did projects in 17 countries just while I was in grad school. So a lot of stuff all over the place, and having to deal with great data, terrible data, long timelines, ridiculously short ones. And I guess that background of doing lots of projects under high pressure kind of made me less tolerant of the existing tool stack than other people, because I was the one, staying up at night trying to get the stuff to be interoperable, for instance. And the other thing that came out of that experience really was that I learned that conceptual frameworks that make academics famous are really made real or die by their supporting technical implementations. And so, like it or not, the GIS layer stack is embedded into the culture of design as implemented by ESRI. Or you can take other ideas like that, your standard good or bad examples. There are defaults in software that are absolutely horrible, and you go around the world and you see everybody's following the software defaults. Well, that's the nasty side of it, but the flip side of it is if we're able to get good concepts into technical frameworks, then ideas can really make it through in that route. And so, in kind of spirit of full disclosure, so I came out of the camp of ESRI. So when I was in grad school, somebody tapped me on the shoulder and asked what I was working on, and it ended up being Jack Dangerman, and ended up going to work for ESRI straight out of grad school. And I was still frustrated about how clunky their software was in a design environment, and I think they were too. And so I worked for Bill Miller, who is still at this geodesign thing from ESRI's perspective several years later, and worked with a small team at ESRI, about 5 people, to do some prototypes and some of the early work on geodesign. Got an offer from MIT to join the planning faculty a few years later, and that was a hard one to say no to, so I moved back to Boston. And spent a few years doing scenario planning in a bit of a global context. I did a lot of work in Florida. I'm not going to show my work today, just so you have some idea. I tend to work on regional planning projects. Current client is like the state of Florida for the Beaches Habitat Conservation Plan. So things at statewide scale involving, in that case, 17 endangered species. So pretty complex projects that have a few hundred people involved. I learned at MIT that I like to write a little bit, but I don't like to write enough to be a permanent full-time academic. I like to implement stuff. And so that led me to Startup Land, and just started a 2-person firm that's basically environmental planning consulting. with aspirations to do more technical work. But so far we've done just custom code for particular clients. And I'm not really going to talk too much about that today, although we can do some of that in conversation. So going back to Geo Design Motivations, I mean, a lot of this has to do, if you're in the industry, with the fragmentation between GIS and CAD and how that played out and left us with tools that are kind of optimized for spatial analysis on one side and for fluid sketching and fluid design on the other side, and didn't connect them very well. So the observation from that I had while I was at the GSD in particular was that much of what GIS is actually used for is really decision support. And even classic cartography, good cartography, is actually for that purpose. It's not just throwing data onto a map, it's trying to tell a message. And that message usually is what kind of decision should we make about the thing that's in the map. So there's a lot of implicit design that goes on the basis of even classic cartography. And then similarly on the CAD side, much of what CAD and now BIM are trying to accomplish is effectively decision support. The initial focus in CAD was much more internal to what's being built, but I'd argue, and I think a lot of the evidence in the room is that the current industry focus is a lot more towards performance-based design. And so in that context, Geo really is talking about design context. So that can be social context, it can be biophysical stuff like runoff, but it's the stuff outside of what you're building that influences what you're building. And because of the history of the tools getting so deep in those particular camps, it's been quite difficult to actually work towards interoperability and to work towards things that recognize that basically AEC activities take place in the real world. They always do, and they always have impacts, both positive and negative. And accounting for those appropriately, if you don't do it with software support, it's going to get done somehow, but it'll get done colloquially and fairly badly sometimes. So the original vision behind Geo Design, at least from my angle, was that design and planning tools should basically be able to account for both positive and negative impacts on the surrounding environment and in real time. Basically, I was tired of methods, for instance, in environmental planning that went through an environmental impact statement that, was a 3-year-long process that then would reflect back on the design. It was to me the ultimate in lawyering up a design process and not really leading to better design outcomes. So underneath that is kind of this sense, the big data kind of set of ideas that for any place in the US, we've got 200, 300 variables available to all of us in the form of web services. And we've got census, national land cover data, national hydrologic data set, national elevation data set. All of those are rough and all of those can be improved with better local data, but why can't we get at least basic socioeconomic and environmental impacts to the point of being simple and routine to perform when we've got this kind of data richness waiting to be exploited. And I guess the third point is respecting the term and the motivation of decision support, which I'm sensitive to, I think, coming out of a lot of conceptual design places, that it's important that we realize that the tools are supposed to inform but not determine design. And so a lot of the pushback against performance-based tools comes from a notion, which I think is a false one, that restricts creativity. I personally think it focuses the creativity on solving the problems. But nonetheless, you have to be aware when you're designing tools like this or thinking about this topic that there is a reluctance on the part of at least traditional designers to engage with some of these richer tools, in part from this feeling that they want things to start open-ended. And a lot of the emphasis in early geodesign work on sketch planning was deliberate in the sense of trying to figure out workflows that start looser before you nail things down. Because computers will tell you a lot of dumb things about a rough sketch design. And you don't want like 10,000 nag warnings telling you that you drew outside the line. And the last point is something that is kind of much more my version and vision of things than the SRI's, but basically I do a lot of work with scenario planning, and it's a slippery word, but in the design profession, scenarios can often be discussed and thought about as equaling plans or equaling design iterations. And those are really important uses of scenarios, but there's also a different and broader use, which is dealing with the state of the outside world. And the state of the outside world under climate change, for instance, is not fixed. The state of the world under human population growth is not fixed. So every design you're going to do is being done in a real world that's changing. And scenarios are a way of encapsulating that without going crazy. And so those external scenarios I find to be really important. And a lot of the policy work I do involves testing a design for robustness against changes in the world. Not so much iterating the design itself, but actually testing the design performance against external changes, not internal changes. So that's kind of the motivations. About 3 years ago now, there were a couple of Geo Design summits put together by SRI, and I was asked to define what I meant by geodesign. And so I came up with this one, which I still stand by, basically. There are simpler and more complex definitions out there. But basically, geodesign is a design and planning method which tightly couples the creation of design proposals with impact simulations informed by geographic context. So to me, that kind of distilled down the notion that we want to be able to do impact assessment, not post hoc, but actually as part of the design process. And I mentioned real time earlier, which is a little more stringent version of geodesign, but nonetheless, at least the idea that while you're designing things, you're thinking about their impacts, and those impacts inform what you're doing, rather than this kind of post hoc. Probably everyone here, a lot of people probably know James Fee here. He's a big blogger and spatial IT director at URS. His view on this I thought was interesting. So he said geodesign brings together the NEPA framework that leads off projects, the engineering work, feedback from citizens, and its presentation toward all on the web. In the past, what happened is all these disciplines were off doing their own thing. It was up to a project manager to bring them together. Most of this time, this resulted in a document that's ended up sitting on a shelf, feedback not being delivered to the groups working on the project, and little collaboration to improve the end results. What geodesign does is to allow these groups to work together to produce plans and designs that will better interact with the environment around them. So this is, a project manager's view on the same idea, really. But it's a much more social version of the definition. I'm a technologist, so I came out of the technology side. But I think both of those perspectives are important because there are professional methods for doing impact assessment, always have been, always will. I think what's new is bringing that into design. Some of the challenges you're all familiar with are probably stuff that you're even thinking about already for the hackathon, but one of the main ones conventionally was classic CAD had stuff in paper space and made georeferencing really annoying. And so that's less of an issue these days, but it's still an issue. The reason it's less of an issue, in my opinion, is a lot of the orthophotography entices people into drawing on stuff that's in coordinate space. And if you can give them decent base data to start, then people are working coordinates whether they know it or care. That's helped a lot. But nonetheless, obviously, there's still a lot of design tools. There's a lot of graphics tools that have trouble dealing with going back and forth to georeference coordinates. The second major challenge is attributing this as classic GIS that acts as if physical design in 3D doesn't really matter, and has a kind of categorical and planimetric view of the world. And I'm not here to bash either of those ways of looking at things. Those are really useful abstractions, but of course they're limited in what they can do. And a lot of the effort, including the stuff I'm going to show you, that comes out of the GIS world starts from that position and doesn't get into 3D and doesn't think about the issues more broadly. And that's been a problem, particular problem for geodesign, I think. Overarching is that in both environments there are lots of analysis tools, but there's no fluid connection, I would say, between actions and consequences. And then to expand on that a little bit, there's a lot of plugins for all these environments, but then the plugins don't talk to each other, which is like the next level of interoperability hell. That you can get some feedback about what you're doing in one domain, but it's not compatible with another plugin or another domain. So basically, all of this comes out of IT restrictions that are like 30 or 40 years old. When people were originally architecting this stuff, they had to think about batch mode. Everything was done as batch mode. And I just see that as current context, bad use of IT and costly in all regards. But nonetheless, there's 40 years of programming that's gone into these conventional frameworks. And people aren't used to building stuff as if there's a world of web services out there, for instance. So quickly, a couple of early attempts. Just going to show you two software things. So my first work at ESRI was on something called ArcSketch. That was a prototype that by shotgun marriage got released as an ArcGIS extension. So somewhere halfway through the project, they told us it was actually going to get released, which led to panic. But it was basically the first half of geodesign, at least in the way I think of it. And in the sense, it was it was work on the design creation side in GIS, but not on the evaluation side. But some of the concepts from that are really applicable anywhere in any software, so that's why I bring it up still. And the main one is something I would call semantic sketching. And that was a really hard sell at ESRI at the time, and in some cases still is. So conventional GIS workflow goes from data to symbology, right? And on the geodesign team, we said, no, a designer expresses intent when they pick a symbol. Why are you going to ignore that? And why not be able to push design back through symbology into data? Well, it's kind of radical relative to the workflow. And yet, it, I think, has proven over time to be a much easier way to get good attribution of stuff. Because basically, everybody knows how to pick a symbol and start drawing. And that also lets you do something which is really useful further down the line, which is a little more technical, but allows you to control the vocabulary that's used in the sketching. And that lets you keep it within the domain of, for instance, geoprocessing models. So you allow complete creative freedom in what geometry is drawn, but you actually constrain the attribution. If you do that, then you can say things about what's being drawn. I'm drawing impervious cover instead of drawing grass, for instance. So that strikes me as a kind of fundamental and useful idea that's really applicable in web frameworks and other frameworks going forward. As I mentioned already, the key limitations relative to ArcSketch were that there was no direct connection to evaluation models, so it really didn't take that on. And frustratingly for me in GIS, even doing a simple takeoff still required you to do like geometry, units conversion work. You'd get things in coverage units, and it gave you the number of square meters in your design, and to get acres was a headache. So those were kind of limitations of that prototype. The current state of the art from ESRI's perspective is something that Bill Miller is now working on called Geo Design for ArcGIS. And he's shown that at several public conferences, so I don't feel too bad showing you that as well. But it is just a prototype. And it's kind of a screenshot of it. Basically, things have gone to a web-based framework. There is still the idea of sketching, but now in addition to the sketching, it's coupled on the back end to the notion of evaluation. And so the pie charts here are, I could show you this dynamically in a movie, but basically they're, as you create polygons, you get real-time update of impact assessment. So it's closing the loop And you know, I think this is a good thing. It's a great prototype. However, there are some notable limitations relative to the AEC community. And the one that's the hardest to say inside ESRI is, well, it's an all ESRI universe. How many workflows and how much of the industry is going to accept doing everything inside one tool? It still doesn't deal with the issue that you might want to have your evaluation models done in completely different software. So it really doesn't take on the interoperability issues at all. That's understandable given where it's coming from, but relative to this group is something worth noting. The second thing is that it has, this is kind of back into what I mentioned earlier, it has this notion that scenarios are basically only design scenarios, or it only supports design scenarios, maybe we should say it that way. So you can do different versions of a design, but you can't track different versions of the outside environment. So for instance, you can't sketch against climate change. And given how I do a lot of coastal planning, so there's nothing I can do that doesn't involve sketching against different scenarios. So I think that's an important thing. I mentioned already, none of these tools have thought forward to 3D, and hopefully that's some of what we can talk about today. I'll give you an example 3D problem, though, that I'm working on. So I'm working on, as I mentioned, the Florida Beaches Habitat Conservation Plan. One of the biggest thorny issues in there is sea turtle lighting. And lighting is basically a 3D problem. So you've got lights shining onto the beach, and that disorients sea turtles. Anything you can think about to solve that problem in 2D is hugely inefficient. And they have that problem in Florida regulation. They've got code now that tries to regulate lights, and they're regulating the light that's in front of the house on the beach side facing the sea turtles the same way that one that's on the other side of the house facing the street, because they have a simple buffer as the rule. And like the only thing the law can tell is it's within 300 feet of the beach. So that kind of idiocy drives everybody crazy. But it's fundamentally because the thing is thought about as a 2D problem and then instituted legally and in code as a 2D problem rather than taking a performance-based approach. So the kinds of things that I'm looking to do involve geodesign in 3D often use viewshed, for instance. So I promised Damon I would do this rough and informal and not do too much bashing. So last topic is basically towards a wider, what would it take to get wider use of these concepts? And my take on the current status is that it's been very slow moving in technical terms. So I've been to every geodesign conference, and largely it's been an ESRI effort. And for good and bad, that means that it's moved more slowly than it could or should. It's worth noting, though, that this idea is getting really good traction academically, and that may sway things a little bit. So Penn State, for instance, has an online GIS master's program, has for a long time. They're now going in to full-fledged geodesign and an online master's program. USC has a full undergraduate degree in geodesign now. And so the concepts behind geodesign could be implemented with pencil and paper. They could be implemented with old technology. When you see it and think about it very broadly, it's just taking into account geographic data and design. People have been doing that for a good long time, a lot of tools. So some degree of this can go on without enabling better tools. But that said, we're not going to get much further, much faster without some tools development. Coming from the MIT side, I noticed right away that there's basically very little conventional research funding for this. And so one of the other reasons that it's not going faster on the academic side is that it's very hard to get funding to do technology research within the planning domain. And that leads us to the point where most implementations are basically single vendor or single project. And so I could show you just a stack of projects. There are a lot of good projects out there. But we come back to something you're all going to be familiar with, that the AEC world is very fragmented. And so if we're all just doing this good projects individually or writing tools to do a single project at a time, we're all reinventing this particular wheel quite a lot. Moving forward, I kind of mentioned this, I'll club it to death here. So sketching is a great, useful starting point, but it doesn't really recognize the problem of a dynamic world. And so, at least in thinking about what we're doing going forward, I'd argue for thinking about scenarios more generally. And in my personal practice right now, basically, I'm not doing physical design, I'm doing spatial policy design. And some of that can be sketched, but a lot of that needs to be done by rule. Or it can be done by sketch, and then you have to reverse out and figure out what the rule is going to be. I want to leave you with 3 discussion questions, basically. And we can have a conversation around these, I hope. But basically, what would I think be useful for us to talk about is which of these ideas are useful to what you currently do. Can the professional community hack some geodesign tools that are more broadly applicable? Back to the point of one of the conference briefing things, is there a need or utility in open source geodesign tool stack? That's something that currently hasn't been done, hasn't been developed, but there are a lot of the pieces in place to do it. Some initial ideas to get this started. I wasn't sure how technical to get here, but essentially there are 2 approaches. For instance, we're doing sketch evaluation on the web side of things, and here I'm only talking web, not desktop. The same principles really apply. You can think about client-side implementations that are essentially things like JavaScript libraries, and those are nice because they can be very light and very distributed. However, getting those things to be scalable is a real problem. And in particular, raster vector stuff is really, really limited. So you're able to do some lightweight vector stuff fairly easily these days in JavaScript, but to do really heavy stuff, you end up wanting to go to a client-server solution. The client-server side of things basically can be done with open standards fairly easily with JavaScript and web feature services / transactional. This is a slash, not a dash, but anyway. And that gives you access to a lot of stuff on the server side that's much heavier duty. And I saw some of this already up on the boards in there, so you're probably familiar with PostGIS and GDAL libraries, Geographic Data Abstraction Library. There's some geos, there's some other good geometry libraries that kind of better run on the server side. And so there's a lot of pressure, I guess, in everyday work to push everything onto the client side, get something up and running quickly and done quickly. However, for scalability, it's hard to avoid thinking about using tools like PostGIS, particularly if you think about raster and vector. Couple of things that we're working on for different projects are the concept of evaluation model servers. So you can think about having, separating the client sketch design from the evaluation, but doing evaluation as a web service. There's a good example of that with some of the, I forget the name, Autodesk's tool that they bought from a third party that does the building energy evaluations. Somebody help me with the name. Remember the name of that stuff? In any case, Autodesk has an example where you can do design inside their tool, and they'll do online building evaluation.
Green Building Studio, Design.
Yes, yeah. The other thing that we're doing, which I'm not able to show today because it's just in progress, but we're using Geo Django for a lot of stuff. I don't know if that framework has come up already in discussion here, but Geo Django is middleware, and the basic function it serves is it does all kinds of user administration for you up front, so you don't have to worry about. So we have website for one of our projects that has 400 users. And my early implementation was doing that myself, and then I got every email for anyone that lost their password, and that was just a nightmare. So quickly went to Django, which does user administration built in and lets people find their own passwords, for instance. The Geo part of it hooks up to PostGIS on the back end. So it's kind of, you can think about it as middleware between a web server and PostGIS. Right now, it is basically strong on vector stuff and on vector stuff only. It does not use the new PostGIS raster functions. So that's been the main limitation we've had. That said, you can still hook back to everything. It's a little low level to do the raster stuff, but you can do it. Let me conclude there and just leave up the discussion questions. And in the time which remains, I'm sorry, I didn't know what time we started, but
We've got about 15 minutes.
about 15 minutes?
Ask a very remedial question. So, coming from building information modeling for construction production, where does this information actually hosted? So all your GIS data, is it something that's actually proprietary to the SRA, for example, or is that, two questions. How is the information collected? Who owns it?
So it's a good question, but there's a dual answer, so sorry for the complexity, but basically the authoritative data needs to be stored basically in read-only version and can be served out either by the agency or more institutionally. And so, for instance, the census data, it doesn't make sense to worry about making that read-write. It's not proprietary. So a lot of the contextual data as stands needs to be read-only, and it's huge. But as soon as you start to alter assumptions about the future, that's where middleware starts to get really useful. Because you often say, okay, yeah, we got the census, but I'm putting 20,000 people there. So the census is going to be obsolete once we have another 20,000 people there. And right now, that part then is kept in proprietary stores usually. The most common ways of doing it, again, it goes back to the client-server stuff. So if it's it's treated as a temporary change, then often it's done as an override in the client. And if it's done more permanently, either, you have two bad choices, I guess, but one is you use something like the Web Feature Service transactional and you keep a local cache of the entire census for your project area, or you have to deal with the problem of doing dynamic updates. So then you store just the polygon that you're changing, but you have to have a way of making sure you can mosaic that correctly with the underlying authoritative data. So there's a complicated answer, but a lot of the stuff doesn't ever need to be proprietary or stored in proprietary fashion. And then, of course, a lot of design stuff absolutely does need to be. And in the example for the Florida beaches, we're using Django in part for that. So basically, that's a situation where the state is going to be dealing with private land on the beaches. And that's really confidential in terms of not jacking up the price of where they're gonna act. And so in that case, the public data, like the species location, the generalized species locations and ranges are all public data. That's in that particular project being served by the Department of Environmental Protection of the state of Florida, and I can just get them to add layers to that project that we need. But then the experimental stuff, hey, we're debating whether we should have this policy or that policy, that needs to be confidential, and that's firewall behind Django. So Django is kind of one technical option for doing that, but it's a nice one in that it does, as I mentioned, all the user administration side. ArcGIS Online also has the ability to create private groups, and there's an interesting open source based solution called Databasins. But Databasins, if I remember its terms of use, is only for conservation planning. I could be wrong there, but basically that's got PostGIS behind it, and it allows conservation users to save and broadcast private data sets. So at the technical level, as long as the stuff is published as a web feature service or a web map service, there's no technical problem with having that done securely. But at a practical level, a lot of the libraries out there, well, it becomes a management question and dilemma, basically, if you're going to start storing copies of big data sets in order to make them fully read-write, or whether you're going to figure out a layering strategy. And most of the stuff I've done for practical purposes, I end up making a copy of the big data. So when it gets to the point where you're actually editing the parcels, it's like I swallow hard and actually end up storing a cache copy of all the parcels data, as bad as that is. Just because it opens up tool-wise what you can do, then you don't need, then your tools don't need to be quite so smart to be dealing with, say, 2 data sources.
Do you work with regional information and groups like fire and police that really have to share information and they need to know where things are, including buildings? Do you have a perspective on that at this point in time?
I haven't dealt with emergency services kind of situations, so I'm mostly dealing with strategic planning. But what's called regional data these days is getting more and more fine-grained. And so, for instance, in Florida with these beaches, it's kind of geographic torture case, right? So it's 800 miles of beach, but you imagine the granularity you want to deal with that. The underlying LiDAR data is 6-inch resolution, which is 2 terabytes worth of data. You do not want to download that to your web browser, but you do actually want to make decisions about the slope of beach, for instance. And so the way we've handled that so far is a lot of pyramid layer stuff and a lot of scale-sensitive cartography. But we're dealing with building footprints in that project, and we're dealing with at the limit 6-inch LiDAR. But of course, if you're zoomed out to the whole state of Florida, you don't care about the 6-inch LiDAR. You care about where the beach is eroding or not. So the world's changing on that stuff, but scale-sensitive cartography is really important in the intermediate run in dealing with that. But we still have problems with then user expectation that we have minimum mapping units in what we're doing. But for instance, the ortho photos make it appear that our data is better than it actually is. And I think that's a dilemma everybody has particularly in the interactive world, is that, and I guess I would say particularly outside of AEC, but when you're dealing with stakeholders that aren't used to scale and scale limits, one of the problems we've had with the tools is, in a sense, they're too flexible, and they allow infinite zoom, for instance, and so we have to put in restrictions or layer in restrictions so that the data, so it's, you don't want to restrict people too much, but on the other hand, you don't want them to make false inference from using the data at the wrong scale.
Yeah, along those lines, are people still rubber sheeting like they used to do in the early days? Or is it, have things been, because we used to joke about how the last person to survey the property isn't going to happen, because everybody's just sort of getting, when you get a legitimate survey and you find out that your fence isn't on your property line and your driveway is on your neighbor's property, and, those kinds of things. I mean, it's a surprise to most people where legal boundaries really are. Are you finding that there's problems that have resulted as directly because the rubber sheeting was done to make communities fit into the boundaries that they had politically?
I think the biggest one that we face, I don't know what others think about this, but I'd go back to the ortho photos, kind of conveying false precision and the registration of those ortho photos. I'm lucky in the particular case of Florida that the state actually has well referenced the ortho photos for the beaches, and they went through and just did it themselves. But still people take our data and overlay it in Google Earth, for instance, where the georeferencing isn't so good. And I don't know how to deal with that one in particular, but I think it's a real issue. Is there's huge false precision in the ortho data, and even if you tell people not, they're so influenced by their perception of the ortho that it messes up everything else in the spatial analysis. And so our only solution to that is, again, a kind of hard one. In a particular context, we had better ortho data, and therefore we used it. But if I was going to have to do a more general system that applied all over the US, then you'd be, I think, stuck with that again, which is that people are going to zoom in on Google Earth and something that was Rambo georeferenced and then try and make a survey level decision on it. And there's nothing to stop them from doing that. There's no warning in the tool. There's no indication of the precision. And again, that's more of a problem interfacing with stakeholders. I have less of that problem with the professionals I work with, but it's a very real issue. It comes up weekly that there's something in our data that is correctly georeferenced in the vector data, but that the orthos are off, and we get blowback from basically the bad georeferencing or lack of georeferencing in the orthos. That said, that's the domain I work in. I don't do a lot of parcel level stuff, although we make inferences off of the parcels. But parcels is another big issue across the US and I guess most countries. I'm fortunate in Florida. Florida actually has statewide parcels data, and all counties have to submit it twice annually. So it still sucks, but it sucks less than many other states. And for regional planning, it actually lets you do stuff across county boundaries in a sensible way. But most parts of the country, in the US, still don't have public parcels data at that level, and certainly don't have it updated twice a year. And so, again, is it geometry problems with the parcels, or is attribution? Most of the stuff I see is attribution problems. Like the stuff was sold last year. Well, I do conservation planning. The biggest problem we have is conservation easements aren't recorded, or they aren't recorded in a timely fashion. So you often get government trying to buy, different branches of government trying to buy the same parcel, and it's already been purchased or had a conservation easement on it. But it's just not getting anywhere near people's expectations in terms of the turnaround from parcel assessor back into a state parcels file. So we have more problems with temporal attribution issues than we do with the geometry in Florida. But that's the nature of the scale where I'm doing stuff. Other questions? Yes?
I think the deeper issue right now in the urban setting is on the utilities, especially the underground ones. We spend a lot of time, as you mentioned, looking at Google Earth, looking at all the photos, and then reconciling parsing. That only gets us to the first base. The second base is our utilities don't follow any of this. And so we spend a lot of time dealing with legacy information. And then for the city here in San Francisco, we have numerous buildings going up. And so the connectivity between old information and new information coming in from Revit and DIM needs to be reconciled. And I don't know if there's the energy or the will to do these kind of things, to create what could be the smart city, accurate information that can be visualized.
You bring up a really important point, and something we struggle with also in our planning work. A lot of the tools are based on waterfall model of information again that assumes that the authoritative information is correct, and then when you get on the ground and you start doing stuff, you actually either realize it's incorrect, or often you actually fix it, right? But there's no way to get that fix back into the authoritative information in a way that's tractable to local government. And so that's a big issue that I think is largely unsolved and almost untalked about. But you've got people doing great survey level work, and 6 months later, the adjacent property is doing it again because there's basically there's no decent update process going back towards the authoritative source. And the only degree to which we've dealt with that is, for instance, in our conservation planning system in Florida, we have a kind of stakeholder review process where we go through all the data layers and we have them review them, and we have a kind of editor for them changing the attribution, so we make sure we get the attribution right. It doesn't change geometry in our case. And we basically try to push that back to the parcel assessors. So we generate a change request back to the parcel assessor. There's 77 counties in Florida, for instance. 3 of them so far have taken updates. So that's not a great odds. Maybe within the city of San Francisco or some other domain that's got better tech staff, there'd be an option or a possibility of doing a project that starts to kind of address this issue. But it's kind of a huge systematic issue. And on the government side, I mean, it's a labor issue largely, right? That they're reluctant to devote the resources to data updates. They don't have those resources right now. And so that only part of that can be solved technologically. But even the part that's technological, like can you push an update back in a technical form that's easy for them to incorporate if they so choose, even that part isn't done, right? So that's proving to be a big dilemma on these information systems. On the other hand, I'd say as soon as layers start to go public and get wider exposure, there's kind of social pressure back on the agencies to clean up their own data. So over time, that helps. In a particular project, it may not help you, but we've found as we started to unearth data in various projects and publish it on the web that it put kind of social pressure back on the agency generating the data to go back and clean it up. And so we've named and shamed a few people into that. But I think you're right to bring it up. I mean, the underground utility side is like a huge big part of this in cities, obviously. And I don't know if you've dealt with this too, but you've got the homeland security stuff, and that makes even the update process yet one more step difficult. Is basically now restrictions on the use of that information. So now it's going back into stovepiped information. It's no longer publicly visible, and changes and updates can be hard to get. I had this in Florida with sewage treatment plants, which you can see from space. It's kind of ridiculous that they're trying to keep their location secret, but basically the Homeland Security regulations were trying to mask the locations, or were no longer releasing even major infrastructure.
I think social planning and social pressure is very important, because I think not only the city of San Francisco and the city of LA now, they have a new mayor in LA, and the mayor is saying, well, you guys are going to put all this information on the web so that every board of supervisors can show their constituents what has been done, and also educate constituents to see what needs to be done. Without this information, CIP planning is very difficult. We can't even mention capital improvement plans without a Chinese fire drill gathering data so that we can make proper decisions in capital planning. So these are kind of issues that are coming up in the city here and also in the cities.
Well, we're going to have to bring it to a close there. I will be around for a little longer and seeing what you guys are doing. So don't be shy. Feel free to come up and ask me, pull me away on stuff. Thank you very much for your participation, and happy hacking.